the notions of productivity that we have in much of essentially anything that's related to business or to to government. The notion's productivity is really peculiar. The notion that we generally have, and it doesn't really fit with innovation, doesn't fit with R&D, but yet it is this sort of direct one relationship that happens is that you produce more widgets, right? Whether it's grants, whether it is papers, whether it is patents, and those things are sort of widgets, right? And the notion is like it's the same sort of direct relationship that people are often talking about with, like, say, building automobiles, and like you have this production line, you're just building more and more automobiles that are coming off the production line. The same sort of translation should be when you write papers. And on top of it is that the whole infrastructure of 10,000 people or 100,000 people is supposed to translate to one person, right? So with a production plant with, say, large auto manufacturers like Kia or Ford, easily translates to a single human being. And there is this sort of, thing where the idea is you just got to produce more widgets, right? Like, oh, you're not productive, so then you just need to produce more widgets, right? At the assembly line and auto plant, you're not productive enough, so you got to scale up more widgets, right? So you're producing 1,000 cars a day. You really should be producing 1,100 cars per day, and you sort of dial it up or dial it down. And the same translates to, a scientist or researchers that you have to publish one more paper a year. And it's easy to dial those things up, right? Like there's just this easy dial. You just turn that on. But what you'll know is that the translation is not very good, right? Um, First of all, translate, if you're looking at percentages, right, in the auto plant, that's the simplest thing I was just thinking about, is in an auto plant, right, you're to increase your productivity, you increase by percentages, right? So you're looking at, okay, I produce 1,000 automobiles a day, which that's an astronomical number. Maybe it's like 200 automobiles a day. Let's say that it's coming off the production line. Well, if you want to increase it and you want to do really well, the next year you should aim for 2020 automobiles, right? Like 220. And the reason, and that would be pretty good increases in productivity. If you look at sort of just how much the growth of business is, the top producers in the world are growing at 10%. And we translate that to humans, right? Let's say you are producing, in my field, if you're producing one a year of papers, and that's what we kind of go by, you are a rock star, like the top percentage of the field of producing one paper a year. Um, and the idea is that we need to sort of up the amount of productivity that you actually have. So you should be producing 1.1 papers per year, right? That makes no sense. That there's no such thing as 1.1. Um, and then, on top of it, the expectation is actually for most people, at least in my field, if you get one every 3 years, one every 4 years, you're doing pretty good. Like that is a solid pace that most people are at, that are not kind of playing. There's a game to it, right? And I'll get into that in a minute. And so if we look at that, then if you're producing one every 3 years, for example, then you should be doing spectacularly well if you are essentially, increasing one every, 3 point or 2.9 years, right? And that's doing spectacularly well if you're doing that. And the idea is you can ramp that up repeatedly. And that's the idea with this, is that year after year after year that you can ramp this up, such that in 30 years you're producing god awful amounts on any of these particular things, right? It's the same with an auto plant. But we know that that is fictitious. That's a fiction that doesn't quite translate very well. Um, and there is a lot that goes on behind the scenes. And usually what people do, if they are talking about increasing productivity and how this actually works, is that they're actually playing a game. And the game often is that there's different ways to get around this game. Is that, maybe you get your name thrown on a paper sort of free of charge. That is very popular. Um, where you do maybe a week's worth of work, if not, less than that. You come in and sort of jump in and your name thrown on a paper. That is very real. Um, and that there is this sort of translation that happens there, that there is this productivity game. If we're to actually look at real productivity and what really people are doing, it does not change that much in any scenario, right? So if you're in an auto plant, you can't work a god awful amount more, right? There's only so much you could do. What you do though, or if you are in academia, or you're an innovator and you're producing patents, you can't sit down longer. You can't, write faster, all those kind of things. It's just not physically possible. As a human being, there's bounds. And so what ends up happening instead is that, hey, you could play this sort of cheat game, right? Like you keep adding, growing your network and getting put on people's papers, things like that. That's the sort of cheat. Um, but there is this, and that would be like, so an analogy would be in the automotive industry in terms of productivity, is that you have a sister plant someplace, and the sister plant produces everything, and then you sort of double count, right? You transfer drive the vehicles over, the vehicles, do the last touch finishing things at that plant, and then they sort of count that as the productivity, and sure enough, productivity is going to shoot right up. Quote unquote, is going to shoot right up. But you're looking at the truth of it. That's not actually what's happening. And so I want you to sort of think about these things. What is changing, and what changes is, okay, there's that sort of cheap game of things, right? But there's also, what changes is the technology that's going around. Sometimes that changes. Sometimes the arrangement of how people are arranged in organizations, right? You get put into different teams, different organizations. Sometimes that has a big impact on it, right? If you're with somebody, so in the automotive industry, if you're with a really good team, things come a little naturally. And it's the same as like if you are in the academic game with a really, really good team, where there's a couple of very clever folks that all want to pitch in. Of course, things go a lot more naturally. It's a lot more easier to do those. But it's not you per se that's actually increasing their productivity, right? You still need downtime, all of that kind of stuff. And it's the same even in an automotive plant. And I love this analogy because it's, you sort of see the absurdity of all of this. Same as in an automotive plant, they're down a lot, and people don't realize that. Like automotive plants, despite, the line might be working all the time, but they're turning it down for maintenance, all those kind of things. And they're really worried about that, right? Like, or they interchange parts. And this is a mechanical machine, right? With all sorts of parts, lots of different moving parts. And they're really worried about making sure that maintenance is up to snuff, that things are running the way that they should be, all of those kind of things. It's the same stuff that you have to actually do with yourself, or as a human being, doing anything that's within this particular sort of gate. Right? Productivity is not what people talk about. That is an absurd construct that, what people are often looking at is that sort of lines coming up. It doesn't tell the story about what's going on. And people's real productivity does not increase over time. Right? There's only so much that you can actually do. And what you should be looking at instead is not necessarily, the productivity increases. That's kind of like poor measuring. What you should be actually looking at is changes in behavior, changes in technology, those kind of things, which are much more fine grained, that make a lot more sense. I was at this seminar years ago, and somebody was looking at, they were looking at gender differences, and they're just breaking it down to male, female in terms of categories. And one other person got really upset and was saying, well, why are you breaking down this really crude measure? You shouldn't be looking at it like that. You should actually be breaking it down into different little tiny bits. And that's actually the truth of it, right? Like the simple fact that on my skin that I am a male doesn't mean anything. I have a lot of effeminate qualities, and I always had. And it's the same as females, right? Like a lot of females have a lot of male qualities, right? Like in a lot of ways, my wife is a lot more male than I am in some respects. And I'm a lot more female than she is in some respects, right? Like that's what I'm getting at, is this sort of notion of productivity in the way that we understand it. It's absurd, right? Like we should not be looking at this. We should be breaking it down. Now, it's on aggregate, right? If you were to look at a production plant, some of these sort of nuances, they disappear. Right? And if you're looking at 800 units a day or, 1,200 units a day, you can start breaking things down. But when you're looking at such a tiny, tiny amount, for human beings, for example, right? Like a single human being, you shouldn't be measuring those particular things. That makes no sense in terms of measuring what is actually going on. And this is actually a real debate that's going on as we look at citation metrics. And one of the very big critiques that's a real critique with these things, or a number of papers or patents that you're producing, the big critique is that, hey, wait a minute, those measures of looking at those things, they were designed to look at journals where there's a bunch of widgets coming out, not just the thing that you are producing, right? It's just what I'm getting at is notions of how we understand the world are often very, very imperfect, and we should question it, right? There's often a lot more that's going on behind the scenes than is told, and getting better measurement is often much more understanding the world in a much more fine-grained way, and realizing, these notions of productivity, that doesn't work often. What we need to really look at is what are things going on in the day-to-day? How can we adjust technology? How can we get better work arrangements? Things that are at a much more macro scale. Ideas of motivation and things like that often don't hold up if you start looking at them. There is a lot more that's going on behind the scenes, and we need to sort of question these things and get a much richer understanding. All right, take care. Have a wonderful day.